This is Jacob Friedman.
And so I'm pleased today to announce that Canada and China have reached a preliminary but landmark trade agreement to remove trade barriers and reduce tariffs.
Yeah, so Canada reaches a tariff deal with China, electric vehicles, canola, some seafood, the kind of thing most people scroll past without a second thought. But that surface story is doing a lot of work to hide what's actually happening here, because this isn't really about canola or EVs at all. It's about power, dependency, and a quiet shift in how countries like Canada are responding to an increasingly volatile American political landscape. And if you care about democracy, economic leverage, and how ordinary people end up paying for geopolitical games, this deal matters more than it looks. Most of us saw the clip of Prime Minister Mark Carney standing in Beijing, calling this a reset, a new era, a landmark agreement. It sounded technical and diplomatic, almost soothing. Tariffs reduced, markets reopened, trade war cooled down. But what that framing leaves out is why this reset is happening now, and what it says about the broader unraveling of the post-war assumptions that once governed Western alliances. You were told this was about smoothing relations with China. What you weren't really told is that it's also about hedging against the United States. Officially, here's what happened. Canada and China reached a preliminary agreement to roll back a series of retaliatory tariffs. China will significantly lower duties on Canadian canola seed and remove tariffs on products like canola meal, peas, lobster, and crab, reopening a market that had been effectively closed. In return, Canada will once again allow Chinese electric vehicles into its market, though with a cap and at a relatively low tariff rate. There are also gestures meant to signal goodwill, like easing travel restrictions for Canadians visiting China. On paper, it looks like a pragmatic compromise between two countries that had backed themselves into a costly trade standoff. But that paper version is incomplete and in some ways misleading, because it treats this as a bilateral dispute resolved through good faith negotiation. The deeper reality is that this deal exists in the shadow of American unpredictability. Canada didn't wake up one day and decide China was suddenly a safe, trustworthy partner. What changed is that the United States, under renewed tariff threats and transactional diplomacy, no longer looks like a stable anchor for long-term economic planning. When Carney says Canada's relationship with China feels more predictable than its relationship with the US, that's not just a throwaway line. It's a quiet indictment. To understand this, you have to zoom out. For decades, Canada's economic strategy was built on an assumption that the United States, whatever its flaws, was fundamentally reliable. Trade disagreements happened, but they were bounded by shared norms and institutions. That assumption has been eroding for years, accelerated by trade wars, nationalist rhetoric, and a political culture in the US that increasingly treats allies as adversaries if it plays well with a domestic base. When tariffs can be imposed or lifted based on a leader's mood or electoral needs, smaller economies start looking for exits. That's the system behind this deal. It's not about Canada suddenly embracing China's values or overlooking serious concerns about human rights, surveillance, or foreign interference. Even Carney, when pressed, didn't claim that. Instead, he leaned into a language of calibration, engagement shaped by interests rather than illusions. That language is doing a lot of work too. It signals a world where liberal democracies are no longer confident that values-based alliances will protect their economic security, so they start making narrower, more transactional choices. And here's where the question of who benefits and who pays comes into focus. Canadian agricultural producers, especially canola farmers, clearly benefit in the short term. Fisheries on both coasts get relief after watching their access to Chinese markets collapse. Consumers may see cheaper electric vehicles. These are real gains, and it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. But there are also costs that don't show up in the press release. Domestic auto industries worry about competition. Workers worry about long-term investment decisions being shaped by geopolitical whiplash. And democracies collectively pay a price when economic necessity forces them to normalize relationships without resolving underlying conflicts. Think about what this looks like in everyday terms. A farmer who couldn't sell their crop last year suddenly has buyers again, but now their livelihood depends on the stability of a relationship everyone knows is fragile. A family looking for an affordable car may welcome cheaper EVs without any real say in the trade-offs that made that possible. Meanwhile, the larger democratic conversation about labor standards, environmental enforcement, and political leverage gets pushed to the margins, treated as an inconvenience rather than the core issue. What's striking is how the media often frames this as a dramatic pivot away from the United States, as if Canada is making a bold ideological choice. That misses the point. This isn't romance, it's risk management. It's what happens when trust erodes and countries start diversifying, not because they want to, but because they feel they have to. The real question the coverage rarely asks is why so many U.S. allies are feeling this pressure at the same time. As you watch this story unfold, it's worth asking what it says about the current moment we're living in. Democracies are being squeezed between economic dependence and political values, forced into compromises that would have seemed unthinkable a generation ago. This deal didn't come out of nowhere. It's the product of years of nationalist trade policy, institutional weakening, and a worldview that treats cooperation as weakness. So the next time you see a headline about tariffs being lifted or markets reopening, pause for a second. Ask yourself what fear or instability made that deal necessary. Ask who had the leverage and who didn't, and ask what kind of world we're building when predictability becomes more valuable than principle. If you find these kinds of deeper dives useful, take a moment to like the video, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. Staying engaged is one of the few ways we can make sense of how these big shifts actually affect our lives. There's another layer here that's easy to miss if you focus only on Canada and China as abstract actors on a chessboard. This deal is also a signal being sent outward, especially to Washington. It says that the old assumption that allies will absorb economic pain indefinitely to maintain alignment with the United States no longer holds the way it once did. That's a profound shift, and it didn't happen because Canadian leaders suddenly became naive about Beijing. It happened because American politics has made long-term planning feel like a gamble. When Carney talks about predictability, he's not praising China's system. He's talking about reliability in process. For businesses, farmers, and workers, predictability often matters more than rhetoric. A tariff you hate but can plan around is sometimes easier to live with than a policy that might change after the next election cycle or the next late-night post. That's the uncomfortable truth at the heart of this story. Democratic volatility has consequences, and those consequences ripple outward, shaping decisions far beyond U.S. borders. You can see this clearly in how the electric vehicle piece of the deal is being sold. Allowing a capped number of Chinese EVs back into the Canadian market is framed as a consumer win, and in some ways it is. Cheaper vehicles help with affordability, and there's a climate argument to be made about accelerating the transition away from gas-powered cars. But there's also an industrial policy dimension that rarely gets unpacked. Canada is trying to build its own EV supply chain, attract investment, and position itself as a player in the cars of the future, doing that while navigating pressure from American protectionism on one side and Chinese manufacturing dominance on the other is a balancing act, not a victory lap, and then there's the political choreography. Carney was pressed about human rights, about foreign interference, about the things that used to define the public debate over China. His answers were careful, almost clinical. He spoke about standing up for values while engaging selectively. That's the language of constraint. It acknowledges that the leverage Canada once thought it had through moral clarity or multilateral pressure is thinner now. Engagement becomes narrower, not because concerns disappeared, but because the tools to address them feel weaker. This is where democratic norms start to quietly erode, not through dramatic collapses, but through accumulated compromises. When economic survival depends on maintaining access to markets that don't share your values, those values become negotiable in practice, even if they remain sacred in speeches. Over time, that gap between rhetoric and reality widens, and people notice. Cynicism grows, trust declines, politics becomes less about shared ideals and more about damage control. Who benefits from that environment? Large exporters who can adapt quickly, political leaders who can frame necessity as strategy, industries that have the resources to navigate shifting rules. Who pays? Smaller producers, workers with fewer buffers, and citizens who are told that complex trade-offs are simply the cost of living in a global economy without being invited into a real conversation about alternatives. The media often compounds this problem by focusing on the drama of alignment and betrayal. Is Canada breaking with the United States? Is this a win for China? Those questions generate clicks, but they obscure the structural forces at play. The more important question is why so many countries are hedging at once, why leaders from Europe, North America, and beyond are lining up to diversify trade relationships in ways that would have been politically risky not long ago. There's a tendency to treat these moves as isolated, each one explained by local politics or temporary disputes, but taken together, they point to something bigger. A world where the guarantees that once underpinned democratic cooperation feel less solid, where economic interdependence becomes a source of vulnerability rather than stability, where leaders talk less about shared futures and more about managing exposure. For ordinary people, this can feel abstract until it suddenly isn't. It shows up in price fluctuations, job insecurity, and the sense that decisions affecting your livelihood are being made far away in rooms you'll never see based on calculations you're not allowed to question. It shows up when political leaders ask for trust while offering less transparency because they claim the stakes are too high for open debate. That's why it's worth slowing down with a story like this and resisting the urge to file it away as just another trade update. These agreements are the visible seams of a system under strain. They reveal how power is shifting, how alliances are fraying, and how democratic societies are adapting, sometimes reluctantly, sometimes quietly, to a world that feels less predictable by the year. One of the most revealing aspects of this deal is not what was announced, but what was carefully avoided. There was no grand vision laid out for a new kind of global cooperation, no sweeping language about reforming trade institutions or rebuilding trust among democracies. Instead, everything was framed in terms of pragmatism, of taking the world as it is rather than as we wish it to be. That phrase keeps coming up in moments like this, and it's worth sitting with because it carries an implicit surrender. It tells you that the horizon of political imagination has narrowed. When leaders speak this way, they're acknowledging that the systems meant to protect smaller democracies from coercion aren't functioning the way they once did. Multilateral frameworks exist, but they move slowly. Enforcement is uneven. And when a major power decides to weaponize trade, the immediate pain is often borne by producers who have no patience for long-term institutional fixes. In that environment, bilateral deals start to look less like betrayals and more like lifelines. The canola dispute is a perfect example. Canadian farmers didn't become collateral damage because of something they did wrong. They were caught in a crossfire triggered by decisions far above their pay grade. Retaliatory tariffs shut them out of a major market almost overnight. The message was clear. Trade can be turned into a pressure point whenever it's convenient. This agreement relieves that pressure, but it doesn't eliminate the underlying vulnerability. It just shifts its direction. That's why it's misleading to frame this as a simple win for Canada or a loss for the United States. It's neither. It's a symptom. It reflects a world in which economic security is increasingly decoupled from political alignment. Countries are learning to compartmentalize, to hold conflicting positions at once. You criticize a government's human rights record while expanding trade. You warn about security threats while deepening economic ties. This kind of cognitive dissonance becomes normalized, and over time, it dulls public debate. There's also a class dimension here that rarely gets acknowledged. When trade policy becomes volatile, the people with the least flexibility suffer the most. Large corporations can reroute supply chains, lobby for exemptions, or absorb short-term losses. Small producers and workers can't. They're told to be resilient, to adapt, to trust that policymakers are acting in their best interest. But resilience, in practice, often just means bearing the cost quietly. You can see this in how fisheries were discussed. The focus is on relief, on tariffs being lifted, on markets reopening. That relief is real. But so is the instability that preceded it and the likelihood that similar shocks will happen again. For people whose income depends on access to a single market, this kind of uncertainty isn't an abstract concern. It shapes decisions about investment, staffing, and whether to stay in an industry at all. And then there's the question of democratic accountability. Deals like this are negotiated behind closed doors, justified after the fact with talking points about affordability and competitiveness. There's rarely a meaningful public conversation about what trade-offs are acceptable or how much leverage a democracy should be willing to cede for economic stability. When those conversations don't happen, people fill the gap with suspicion. They assume elites are making choices that benefit themselves while leaving everyone else exposed. This is where media framing really matters. When coverage emphasizes the personalities involved, the optics of meetings, or the supposed drama of geopolitical realignment, it distracts from the structural issues. It turns a systemic problem into a series of episodic events. Each deal becomes a story unto itself, rather than part of a pattern that deserves scrutiny. That pattern is one of fragmentation. The post-war ideal of a rules-based order was never perfect, but it provided a shared reference point. As that reference point weakens, countries improvise, they pursue narrower interests, they make peace with contradictions that would have sparked outrage in the past, and they ask citizens to accept this as realism rather than resignation. The danger is that over time, realism becomes a convenient shield against criticism. If every compromise is justified as inevitable, it becomes harder to imagine alternatives. Politics shrinks to crisis management. Democracy becomes procedural rather than aspirational. And people who sense that something has been lost are told they're being nostalgic or naive instead of being invited into a serious discussion about what kind of global system we actually want to live in. This is where the question of power becomes unavoidable. When we talk about trade deals and tariffs, we're really talking about who gets to set the terms of survival in a global economy. And right now, those terms are being shaped less by shared rules and more by leverage. Countries with large markets can impose pain and then selectively relieve it. Smaller economies respond not by winning, but by managing risk. In that sense, this deal reflects a broader shift away from collective solutions toward individualized bargaining. Each country is left to figure out how to protect itself in a system that no longer reliably protects anyone. That might sound like an abstract geopolitical trend, but it has very real implications for democratic life. When politics becomes about constant triage, long-term commitments to values and institutions start to feel like luxuries. There's also a cultural shift embedded here. For years, political leaders in liberal democracies told their citizens that economic integration would reinforce democratic norms. Trade, we were told, would encourage openness, moderation, and reform. That narrative has largely collapsed. What's replaced it isn't a coherent alternative, but a kind of quiet fatalism. We trade because we must. We engage because we can't afford not to. The moral claims are still made, but they're increasingly hollow. You can hear that hollowness in how human rights concerns are handled. They're acknowledged, gestured toward, and then set aside as something to be managed rather than confronted. This doesn't mean those concerns disappear. It means they lose their power to shape outcomes. Over time, that erosion seeps into domestic politics too. If values are negotiable abroad, people start to wonder how firm they really are at home. And that's where the connection to democracy becomes clearest. Democratic systems rely not just on elections, but on trust that institutions will act in the public interest, guided by principles that don't change with every gust of pressure. When citizens see leaders repeatedly explain away compromises as unavoidable, trust phrase, even if the compromise makes sense in the moment, The cumulative effect is corrosive. There's also an information problem. Most people don't have the time or resources to track the details of trade policy. They rely on intermediaries, on media, on political narratives to make sense of it. When those narratives stay at the level of winners and losers or national pride and diplomatic drama, they fail to equip people with the tools to understand what's actually at stake. That leaves a vacuum that can be filled by resentment, misinformation, or apathy. Think about how this plays out in everyday conversations. Someone hears that Canada is letting in Chinese EVs again and assumes it's either a sellout or a stroke of genius, depending on their priors. Rarely does the discussion get to the deeper question of why Canada felt boxed in enough to make this choice in the first place. Rarely does it connect back to the instability of a global system where trust is in short supply. This is why following the power matters more than following the headlines. The power here isn't just in Beijing or Ottawa. It's in the ability to impose uncertainty, to make access to markets conditional, to force others into reactive positions. When that power becomes normalized, it reshapes behavior across the board. Countries hedge, companies diversify, individuals grow more cautious, optimism gives way to defensiveness, and yet this moment also reveals something else. It shows that the old story of inevitable alignment among democracies was always more fragile than we like to admit. It depended on economic growth, relative stability, and a shared belief that the system, while imperfect, was moving in the right direction. As those conditions weaken, so does the glue that held that story together. The risk now is that we drift into a world where every relationship is transactional, every principle conditional, and every crisis met with a shrug and a workaround. That kind of world doesn't collapse overnight. It erodes slowly through deals that make sense individually, but collectively point toward a loss of coherence. And once that coherence is gone, rebuilding it becomes much harder than maintaining it ever was. It's also worth noticing how normalized this has become. A decade ago, a democratic government openly describing an authoritarian state as a more predictable partner than the United States would have triggered a much deeper reckoning. Today, it barely causes a ripple beyond a few sharp headlines. That should give us pause, not because the comment was reckless, but because of how unsurprising it felt. We've adapted to instability so thoroughly that we no longer register how profound it is. None of this means there are easy answers, but it does mean we should resist being lulled by technical language and diplomatic optimism. Trade deals are never just about trade. They are expressions of power, fear, leverage, and belief. They tell us what governments think is possible and what they've quietly given up on. As viewers, as citizens, our role isn't to demand purity from leaders operating in an imperfect world. It's to ask harder questions about why the world has become so imperfect and who benefits from keeping it that way. It's to notice patterns, not just events, to connect a tariff deal here with a policy reversal there and see the outline of a system under stress. So the next time you hear about a reset or a landmark agreement or a pragmatic compromise, don't just ask whether it helps in the short term. Ask what kind of future it assumes. Ask whether it makes democracy feel more resilient or more conditional. Ask who gets predictability and who lives with uncertainty. These conversations matter because the more clearly we see what's happening, the harder it becomes to accept erosion as normal. This is Jacob Friedman signing off.
This is Jacob Friedman.